Coleen Haskell is a wildland fire meteorologist, which is a unique role to play. You can look through her entire biography, which is impressive there in your packet. But what it really boils down to is this, is that Coleen has a passion for weather. She understands fire and emergencies, including floods, because she was inspired to start her meteorological work after the Big Thompson flood of 1976. And she's going to provide us a perspective on what the weather trends have been doing for our fire behavior and what 2022 looks like. So please join me in welcoming Colleen.
Good morning. Good morning. Bear with us while we get the first presentation loaded up here. From the outset, I just want to say, don't shoot the messenger, right? I mean, I'm just here to kind of share with you where we are now, what we've seen over the last couple of seasons, and how it's set the table for where we are going forward with this season. And we don't call it a fire season anymore. It's a fire year. As you've seen, things are happening year round, not according to the calendar. And so we're changing the way that we think about fire in those constraints that are now part of our culture. One of the things that I want to mention is that throughout all of the slides that I show you today, or if I mention something, how it is according to, compared to normal or compared to average, that's a very relative term, right? So climatologically speaking, we usually use 30-year climate periods, and those were just updated last May. So that changes everything. Last year, when we were looking at the maps, if we saw something compared to normal, it was using statistical data from back in the 80s, in the 90s. So now we're using the updated climate information, and it'll tell the story. If I can learn how to use the clicker, we'll be in business.
Go ahead and try it out. No.
It's just that way.
So
There we go. All right, so they mentioned the Rocky Mountain Area Coordination Center, and that's where I work in Lakewood, Colorado for predictive services. My paycheck comes from the National Park Service, but we're truly an interagency group of folks working to help with decision support. And so my part is the meteorology, but we also analyze the fuels in the fire danger, the total fire environment. And part of our housekeeping today is to let you know the areas that we have broken down the 5-state geographic area into. We have 28 predictive service areas, and on each of the graphics, I've tried to put a star to reflect where we are in relation to the geographic area. Many of the slides that I'll show you are not zoomed in on Routt County, because I want to give you the perspective of what the climate signals are doing, what the weather is anticipated to be outside of our neighborhoods, because we share resources. There's not enough to go around. And so part of our job is to prioritize and pre-position those resources according to where we think the risks are highest. And that's why your exercise later today is so important, so that you can help be part of those decisions, help define what those values at risk are, so that we can make those priorities according to the needs in the field. Okay, so we have 28 of those predictive service areas, and when I do a daily weather forecast or a seasonal outlook, those are the reference points that I'm using, and they've been determined statistically by climatology and vegetation types, as well as the fire occurrence that we've seen over the last 20 years or so. Some of the things that I'm basing this presentation on today, first are the antecedent or the existing conditions that we've already experienced. So looking at things from the past, even the past couple of years, maybe going back to looking at soil moisture anomalies. And then we'll look at what the predictors are, what the highest bias predictors are, where we have our confidence, some of the areas that we're not so sure about. And then finally, just in summary, if you're gonna zone out on the whole rest of the presentation, I'll just tell you, above normal significant high fire potential is what we're expecting, so we need to eat our weeks this year. All right. No, please stay with me. Okay, so looking back in time at those antecedent or pre-existing conditions, and like I said, I'm zoomed way out so that you can see how Routt County fits in with the rest of the area. Over the 90-day period from January through March only, we saw actually cooler than average temperatures across most of the lower 48, with the exception of California and the Southeast United States. And then things kind of changed. We are in a La Nina cycle. This is a double dip, so we were in it the previous year as well. And so the signal really, the ocean signal and the atmospheric signals really synced up together. And we saw that develop in the month of April so far. And the reason I say that, it's a pretty clear pattern where you see this north to south split, where the warmer temperatures compared to average were focused over the southern part of the US, and the cooler temperatures were focused over the northern plains. So although we were slightly cooler than average by about 5 degrees, and when I say average, that is using the new climate. The Rocky Mountain area that we forecast for is pretty much right on the split. So that makes kind of a spring predictability barrier. That's where it introduces some uncertainty, right? Our confidence isn't quite as high as far as temperatures go, just based on so far what we've experienced in April. Now, if we look at the same map compared to precipitation for the January through March time period, all of the yellow, the gold, and the red colors are much below average. And when I say much below, in some cases, 0%, like none, for that period starting in late winter and going through early spring. Now, you notice that we actually had a pretty good precip signal east of the Continental Divide for the 3-month period. You know, after July and going through January, we really didn't have any early season snowpack, and this is considered a snow drought because it's the shortest snow period that we've had on record. But we did start picking up some storms coming in from a northwesterly direction, dropping in along the east side, especially the Front Range. What's really interesting to me about this signal is during the January through March time period, the Front Range along the foothills, Boulder County, they got 82 inches of snow. They were the wettest place in the whole geographic area, and they were the ones with the fires. That's as good as it gets. Hate to say it. But look around at some of the other places, you know, in the country. This is just January through March, of course, but going up through the Laramie Basin and into Wyoming, they were slightly above average, and then down through New Mexico as well. So looking more closely in time, this is just so far for the month of April. And you can see that we have really turned the tables just in the last few weeks with regard to dryness compared to average for the Rocky Mountain area and all the Southwest. And things have definitely improved over the eastern part of the US, which is good because typically fire season starts in the Southeast and then moves into the Southern Plains. So we don't want to be in fire season in the Southwest, in New Mexico and Arizona at the same time that we're fighting fire in Florida, because we may not have enough resources to go around. And that's where those important decisions come as far as where we're going to put our money. So things aren't looking good for the last month, but overall, in the context, you saw that we did get a little bit of a breather for the spring on the east side. On the west side here, not so good. However, last weekend, we did actually kick up or boost our snowpack and the water that's contained within the snowpack with the storms that came through. This is a snowpack graph, and compared to seasonal averages, we're still way below. Looking at the black line here, that is where we are tracking right now for 2022. The gold line is what we saw at this time last year. So we actually saw a little bit of a bump towards what we were experiencing this actual same time last year, but we're still way below average. So the thing is, in the month of April with these spring storms, things are variable, right? We're melting, we're still accruing snow, and so it can be very, very wishy-washy, the statistics for the month of April. So typically, April 1st is the cutoff for the snow year. October 1st is the beginning of the hydrologic year. But as I mentioned, this was the shortest snow season of all. So I had to throw a bit of encouragement in there and to show you that, hey, you know, we're about where we were last year, and we made it.
What year is your extreme minimum? Is that 2002? The red line bottom?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. But what I will do is find out. This is an NRCS graphic, and I'll look into that. That's a good question. I mean, a lot of people are trying to figure out what those analog years are. And I just don't know for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised. Okay, now one of the other things that we have to mention, right, is that something that characterized our spring, well, our winter and spring this year is the sheer frequency of the wind events that we saw. And not only how often we've seen the wind, but how strong it was. The magnitude of those events was historic in some cases. So what I did is I pulled up some graphics for Cheyenne. I mean, it's always blue there, right? But Boulder and also Grand Junction. And so just for example, I know it's, you know, apples and oranges, but from the National Weather Service in Boulder, 2022 is shaping up to be the second highest frequency of high wind warnings that were issued. Well, this isn't exactly validation, but you know, their verification is very good. And so second highest number of warnings that have ever been issued through the period. And they start in the fall. The wind season for their record keeping starts in the fall and goes to the spring. When I looked at Cheyenne's, it was their all-time record. And for Grand Junction, they are already pushing record as well. However, Grand Junction's records for high wind warnings, it's only a sample size of 3. So it's not very often that you get strong wind events here. Well, you do, but not typically because of this climate signal. It's usually from the thunderstorm gusts. So not only the very strong winds, but the frequency, at least once a week, and in some cases historically events that we've seen on the east side, and that's something that's really started to shape not just our fuels conditions, the state of the vegetation, but also the snow melt. You know, you get a little bit of snow and pretty soon it's just gone because the wind would heat it up. Okay, and what it had, the effect is that the soil moistures and the anomalies are how that compares to what is normal. What I have is the actual amounts on the left, and this is as of the last day of March. So what you're seeing on the red and the orange colors, those warm colors, those are all of the driest soil moistures. So California, even though remember they had all those epic winter storms early on, then they got nothing, and then last week they picked it up again. But it's overall what you need is that steady diet of snow throughout the season. And they've been in such a deficit for so long. This is a long duration event for them to see dryness, that they are the most deficient in Northern California compared to the rest of the country. They also, on the right here, is how that compares the change that we've seen just since the end of January through April 25th. So not only were they in a long-term deficit, but in the short term, their signal is also very dry in terms of the soil moisture and how it compares to the average. In contrast, we are starting to see this signal here in the Tennessee Valley and all the way up through Great Lakes, where they actually have flood warnings for all the moisture that they've started to see. And then as well into the northern plains of North Dakota and just northern South Dakota. And again, the reason I show you these other areas, it's outside of our, you know, our neighborhood, but these are the places where we're going to be sending resources to fight fire first before we're able to get them. So for us, we see a lot of white on the map, and that means we haven't really changed too much. Yes, the actual values tell us that we are deficient somewhat in terms of millimeters of moisture that we need for ranching, for our watersheds, availability, but we haven't really started our spring flush or our melting yet. And we still have a couple, as we'll get into the forecast here, we still have a couple more events on the horizon that I can hang my hat on until we really dry out. Okay, so we're boiling it down from the big level to what we're seeing in the soil and how that affects vegetation, or what we call fuel that's available to burn. If we look at the drought compared to last year, so on the right is 1 year ago, April 20th, and the most extreme colors, once again, is purples. You could see where you were at. Here's the star, Routt County. You were in the D3, which is extreme drought, right on the neighborhood that on your doorstep was an exceptional drought, and that's the highest category. This was last year when your meteorologist was telling you about fire season, and you're like, oh no. Okay. Well, we've seen a lot of improvement in western Colorado. I mean, we're still in drought, moderate to severe drought, and that's not good, but I'm just saying in relation to where we were last year, I think we're doing pretty good. We're moving in the right direction. And a big part of that was the adequate snowpack that we saw this year. And I'm just saying adequate because it was almost normal, but we're making up for long-term deficits like what we see here from last year. The other thing that really saved our bacon last year was we had a monsoon following 2 previous years of a non-monsoon where we didn't get those thunderstorm rains. And so that's why when we're looking at all of these predictors, we have to stretch back in time maybe a couple of years, right? So the areas that we are really concerned about for this year, in terms of long-term drought, are southeast Colorado, southwest Kansas, and then all through the plains, as well as parts of Wyoming. Eastern South Dakota, western South Dakota, they've seen quite a bit of improvement, but they don't have any grass to burn because of the drought last year. They just don't, and that's kind of a mixed blessing. I mean, they don't have much for grazing and those sorts of things. They have other concerns, but in terms of fire potential, we have to look at that too and say, well, yeah, it's super dry and the soil's dry, but there's nothing to burn, so we're going to scratch it off the list, and we're going to move on to the places that do have abundant fuel loads or carryover grasses from last year. Okay, so one of the things that Kevin and I are talking about is a vapor pressure deficit, and we won't go into too much science. I don't want to roll your eyes in the back of your head this early, but one of the tools that I want you to be aware of for those closet weather peaks is called the eddy. And this is a measure, we call it the thirst of the atmosphere. So those soil moistures, if they're very dry and they're exposed to the air, that interaction between the soil and the atmosphere is the zone where we see these backwards, where if you have very dry conditions, it's going to take a lot to overcome that. And I don't just mean thunderstorms, it needs to be long duration, gentle rains in the spring leading up that will really soak into the soil and become beneficial. So the eddy tool is something that we use on a short-term basis instead of just looking at those long-term for the spring, May, June, July, as we go into summer, before those fuels really clear out and become crispy again. We look at that eddy, the evaporative demand drought index. And primarily I look at it on a 2 to 4 week basis. But I did want to show you where we are compared to what we saw a year ago. So a year ago, we were looking at a real deficit in the dryness up in the Pacific Northwest, and you're already starting to see the signal coming into the Southwest United States. And we were in pretty good shape, considering, now remember I just showed you the long-term drought from a year ago, western Colorado was as bad as it gets. But these are the shorter term impacts, and we were sitting pretty good. This year, our short-term predictors are showing us that we are extreme in the Southwest United States and then looking up into eastern Colorado and onto the high plains. But for Routt County specifically in western Colorado, we're pretty good. And the reason is because we got those events like the 12th and the 22nd of April. Those ones that boosted our snowpack and snow water equivalent are going to carry us at least for a little while. So we look at the long term, but we also look at the most recent, because that's what's going to grow our grasses. We're starting to go through green up. We can see it, things are coming to flush, we're going into the growing season, and that's going to buy us a little bit of time. That's why we're not quite as concerned about Routt County right now as we are in some other areas where they're not greening up at all because it's too dry. They don't have any moisture for that grass to start growing. They're saying, no, we don't have enough energy. Okay, let's zoom out a little bit, and you've heard of El Nino, La Nina, Southern Oscillation. I mentioned that this is a double dip La Nina here. So you might be wondering where is it going from here? So this is the part of the show where we switch gears and we start looking at what the predictors are instead of what the antecedent conditions are. But starting with April, May, and June, the blue bar represents that our probabilities are extremely high that we will continue to see a La Nina signal in the ocean atmospheric circulations. This gray bar here is for neutral, so we don't see any red. There's basically no probability of an El Nino at this point until we get into later summer, into spring, or even next winter. As we go through in time, that probability of the blue bar or the La Nina starts to wane, and then by the time we get to about August, well, July or August, we're looking at equal chances of seeing a neutral versus a La Nina. And Chief, you were talking about, well, what was the lowest snowpack year? You know, we look at those analogs and we try to remember back in time, what were the big events for us? In fire terms, we use pocket cards. If somebody comes in from out of area and they're just looking at weather and fire activity, they're like, well, what was your big year? And what were some of those predictors? And maybe we could project those onto this year and use those as decision tools. So that's one of the reasons that we look at the climate signals, is because La Nina and El Nino years do have some predictability in terms of what our fire system might look like, because those big climate signals dictate what our weather patterns are, especially this year. There's many other climate signals that we look at, and I won't bore you with those, but La Nina is, this year in particular, is one of our biggest predictors, even though we still have the spring predictability barrier or some uncertainty. Well, speaking of analog years, this is where we get into looking at those comparisons or pocket cards. So some of the interesting trends, and I say interesting in that it's eerily similar to 2012. In terms of just the climate, of course, there's nuances, there's differences across different parts of the state. But in 2012, you know, our wildfire and acreage that we burned, the number of acres and the number of fires were well above average, and we're tracking fairly similar in terms of what we're seeing with the climate. Dating back to December. 2002, we're tracking a little bit similar to that in some ways, but for different reasons. I won't say it's a good match necessarily. And then 2008 is another year that we're kind of looking at on the side to see if we have any similarities that we might be able to dig into. Okay, so moving forward with those predictors, these climate outlooks from NOAA's CPC, these are for temperature and precipitation. They are heavily weighted this year on the La Nina signal. Not always, but we do provide input to these decisions the week before we do we do a monthly seasonal outlook that's published on the 1st of every month. So like you get a little bit of a preview compared to everybody else. But the CPC is telling us that for the 3 to 4 week period that will be from May 7th through the 20th, Routt County is going to be right on the edge of warmer than average. And again, this is taking into consideration climate change with the new climate normals. So we're just on the edge. You can pretty much expect to see temperatures a little bit warmer than average during the upcoming short term. And then the brown or the gold colors here are below average or below normal precipitation. So it's going to be drier and warmer than normal. In contrast, it looks to us like we're going to be able to buy a little bit of time in Alaska. Their season typically starts a little earlier than everybody else, and they have had some large fires. But that might help us to keep some of those aircraft or crews here in the lower 48 in case we need them for our warm and dry. And these are the kinds of tools that the decision makers are using right now to get everybody trained up and say, hey, it looks to me like the Southwest is going to need some stuff, guys. All right, so if we look a little bit further in time, the graphs on the top are for the May through July timeframe, focused on June. There's a lot of red on the map. I'm not going to lie here. I mean, this is ridiculous how great expansive of an area is expected to be so much warmer than average. And this is the probability. That means there's high confidence that it's going to be hotter and drier than average. You'll notice though, this is the flying joint here. This little green above normal precipitation that starts to poke into Arizona and Mexico in June. That tells us that the monsoon, the North American monsoon, is going to be starting up a little bit earlier than average. And then it continues for the months of July and August, especially for July. I mean, that is typical for us to start seeing those monsoonal thunderstorms coming into western Colorado. And that's great, right? You want the moisture and everything, but until the atmosphere and all those dry soil moisture, that feedback loop, until that juices up in the lower atmosphere, we're going to have a lot of dry lightning. So this is a good news, bad news, or I'm going to say it's a bad news, good news thing. We're going to go through a period after Rena where we're going to get a lot of lightning, I think, more than usual. And the reason I say that is because this to me is a pattern recognition that we're going to have a big ridge of high pressure. So when you're watching the nightly news and Larry Green, I'm dating myself. I used to work for Larry Green, so he's my favorite. When you're watching the nightly news in your pajamas and Larry Green says high pressure ridge here, what happens is the lightning tracks up underneath that ridge. The lightning is going to track. There's a high pressure system here and a low pressure system over California, and those are semi-permanent features. And what happens is the cold moisture comes up through the desert, and it's so high up in the atmosphere that those cloud bases that you see, those beautiful sunsets here, they're really high up. And so any rain that you get is going to produce what's called verba, like we had yesterday, where it just looks like these curtains coming down, you can almost grab them, right? That's just going to bring wind and lightning for the month of June. That's the way I see it in terms of this pattern that's setting up. But the good news is by July, even though this says equal chances for us, we're in this wide area, I think that we will see adequate precipitation for July and probably into August on the west side of the continental divide. Can I get So it really is setting up this particular scenario is telling me that it would be much similar to last year. I mean, we got those summer rains, but they didn't come until July. So this may be fast and furious, lots of fire ignitions and initial attack early on in June until those storms really start in the ground. Okay, so speaking of the monsoon, I'm going to get back into the geek zone just for a second because our program manager for predictive services published some work on the monsoon and how to look at those patterns. And the one that we're kind of keying in on this year is when we transition from what's called the southwesterly flow to more of a westerly flow. And so as that switch occurs, that will give us a little bit more predictability as far as telling you on our monthly briefings and our daily briefings that we do a multimedia recording to let people know, like 3-minute, quick and dirty what we're looking at. But it's based on some of the research that's already been done here in the Western U.S. And my colleague Valerie Myers, and she's a meteorologist there at the RMAC as well, and she's done extensive work on Southwest monsoon too. So if you're interested in those kinds of things or watching it as it develops and tracking it, there's some pretty good literature out there, and she's a good resource. Okay, yeah, advertising is over. One of the other things that, aside from weather, not looking at the climatology necessarily, but as we know, this is already baked into the statistics. The number of acres burned across the Rocky Mountain area, which includes the 5 states, and then the number of fires, which is on the bottom. We show a signal that's, it's a dual signal. We have that spring bump for both. And then we have our, what we consider to be our core fire season. Now, this is just through 2012, and we are in the process of reanalyzing that according to the QC data that goes through 2018 and beyond. So Kevin's going to help me out with that. And we're going to get some newer data. But what this shows us is that, why do you think that is? I mean, this is an interactive thing. If anybody wants to throw out, why do we get that spring bump and then all of a sudden, we got a little bit of a lull in May. Yeah.
They have to do a little bit of kind of wind season and happens right.
Well, the climatology of the wind, yes, during the spring season, but also, what else is going on there? Why do we see a dip that we don't see as many fires in April and May? Typically. Snow melt. Green, we got it. Right, so exactly, all those things come into play. And so those are the things that we're thinking about for the next 3 to 4 weeks, in addition to what the weather prediction is. So not only climatology, fire history tells us that we're going to see a little bit of a break. This is time for us to regroup, do exactly what we're doing right now, start talking about it, thinking about it, looking to prepare things for what's to come. We're going to need to take advantage of that spring lull.
Sorry, I didn't hear what the answer was.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so the answer is, we do get snow melt, so things are a little bit more flush in terms of the moisture, and we get green up. The fine fuels or the grasses and the brushes are starting to go through their annual growing cycle, and they're not available for. You throw the green grass on the campfire, and it's not going to do anything but put out some nasty smoke. But you get that nice dry grass. Once we cure it out, and it's already completed its growing season, out into late July or August, it's crispy again and ready to go. And that's why we see this spike. So now's the time, and that's what I'm saying, take advantage of this time to prepare during the lull before we really hit the ground running in June with those lightning conditions. Okay, this is the moment you've been waiting for, right? This says it all. We got a lot of red on the map, and here's why. I gave you the why already, but this is what we've come up with for fire potential for the month of May. We are looking to see above normal, which is in the red colors, through southwest Colorado, all of southern Colorado and western Kansas, and then extending up the northern Front Range all the way to the South Dakota border. Now, we're seeing that split because of the La Nina for the month of June, but we're going to continue to see above normal all the way. Routt County is just kind of tucked in here for June. You're going to be on the fringe of it or surrounded by it. So I'd say I could go either way for June. But we have to stick to those predictive service area boundaries when we assign above or below normal potential. As we get into the month of July, fuels are cured. We've got those lightning ignitions. That's going to continue along the Continental Divide and eastward, but you notice that we've taken out southwest Colorado and northwest Colorado for the most part. It's going to be normal. And that's because I think that's the onset of the moisture with the monsoon. We'll have already seen, although not all, we'll have already seen the majority of our lightning ignitions, and we'll be benefiting from the moisture that we get. Likewise for August, for Routt County, for southwest Wyoming, not a lot of fuels in here, but we are expecting to see a very significant break from west to east, where the above normal significant fire potential will be on the eastern plains and foothills, as well as the crest of the Continental Divide, just depending on where that monsoon sets up. So we're in the end of April, and we've got a couple more months to kind of fine tune this forecast, but this is what we know so far for our outlook moving forward based on what we've already experienced and what our predictors are telling us. Is there time for questions? Okay.
Take one or two questions.
Yeah, we're just a little behind, and we could do this all day. I mean, as depressing as it is, it's fascinating. So I do know there are questions out here, so we have time for one or two questions. We're gonna make sure that you wave your hands and use the microphone because we're recording this, so we wanna make sure we capture it. So, Michael.
First, thank you for giving us monsoon seasons here.
I'm in sales, not production.
Second, can you just explain a little more, you mentioned a couple times that our, really short snow season, and can you describe a little better what that means?
Sure, as I mentioned, the beginning of the hydrologic year starts October 1st and runs to April, or it runs October to October for the year. But for our snowpack season, it's pretty much October to April, but we really didn't start seeing measurable snow until January. And then it cut off, like I showed you in March, and then in April, we've only had a couple of quick hitters. So not only did we saw adequate, like 90% of average snowpack in the highest basins, for our water supply for grazing. But it was a very condensed period of time when we saw the storms come through, if that makes sense.
Great question. One more question, anybody?
Well, if you have any questions later, this isn't the only time. I've got my email address there and also Valerie Myers. And I referred to her with the Monsoon research. Please reach out to us anytime. I encourage you to listen to our podcast or track our products as they are published on the 1st of every month for updates on this forecast. Thank you.
Excellent. Let's hear it for Colleen. Wow. Thank you. And Colleen came all the way up